Thanks very much. Okay, let's get beginning. This is a picture of, or will be, here we go. This is Robert Nairn, and Robert Nairn was a member of St. Paul's Church. In fact, he was a member from his infancy right the way through. He was involved in the Sunday school here. When he got a little older, he served at the altar. He was a member of the choir. He was a member of vestry, and he even ended up being the leader of the Sunday school. And when the Great War started, Robert Nairn enlisted in the 2nd Field Company of Engineers, and he was stationed in Gallipoli as part of the 4th wave of reinforcements in 1915 when he was aged 24. They landed here at ANZAC Cove, which you can see sort of lower here, and their base was stationed at Hell's Spit. Now, Robert Nairn and his men as engineers, they were trying to help break the gridlock situation that was going on because you'll probably know that the Turks and the Anzacs were kind of trapped in a trench conflict along the mountainous ridges at Gallipoli, and so he and his men kind of designed homemade grenades using artillery fuses, and you could fire them from a mortar. And this is a trench mortar used at Gallipoli, and he would shoot these grenades using a separate projectile explosive that you'd put in the mortar first, and lots of tests went very successfully, so they carted all of these things up to Quinn's Post, a place which you can see here where the trenches were at their absolute closest, and to try and break the deadlock. But on the very first shot, they lit the fuses on the bombs, but the fuse for the projectile didn't light, which left a lit grenade in the mortar with no way of firing it. Now, Sergeant Nairn could have run for cover, but to save his men, he jumped forward and tried to defuse the grenade. After 3 failed attempts, it exploded and killed Robert Nairn. Now, Robert is remembered with a brass plaque that hangs in this church room today. It's actually just there beside the vestry doors on the wall. And Robert Nairn gave his life, as the plaque says, for church, king, and country. And on ANZAC weekend, we remember people like him and the sacrifices they made, but he's actually just one example of a really rich military heritage that we have here at St. Paul's. Now, we're surrounded by this beautiful building. It's quite unique in New Zealand, and it's in a neo-Gothic or Gothic revival style, and it's kind of a later attempt to bring back the way of building like they did in the medieval days so that they can reflect the story of God and the mystery of who he is and our salvation. And that's a brilliant thing, but interwoven amongst these kind of grand designs is actually a much more personal story. There's a subtext that tells a story of our parish and of the people who have served in this church that's kind of interwoven amongst it all. And this raranga is reflected in our brass, it's carved in our stone, and it's stained in our windows. And today, being Anzac weekend, we're going to have a look at some of these. So the 4 primary icons that kind of summarize St. Paul's heritage are king, bishop, soldier, and layman. And they are the 4 lower windows in our western wall. And they each represent a certain element of our heritage. They're also carved in our stone. So if you came in through the front doors here today, you would have walked in between the bishop and the king. If you came in through the car park, you would have passed between the soldier and the layman. And I'd encourage you, after today's talk, maybe have a little treasure hunt around the building and see if you can spot some of the things I'll be highlighting today. But again, today being Anzac weekend, we're going to have a look through this soldier theme, represented by our carved knight and the 3rd window, Theodoric of Nyssa. Now, most of you guys probably know that this is St. Paul's 3rd building, but what you probably don't know is that all of the buildings we've used have actually been the work of military officers. The first church, built in 1841, as Johnny said, the same year that Auckland was founded, was built by William Mason. He was the first superintendent of public works in New Zealand, but he was also the lieutenant of the militia in Auckland in 1845. 20 years later, the building was massively expanded. It was more than doubled in size. The interior was totally refurbished. The roof was replaced. Newspapers at the time said it's such a huge change that it's actually an entirely different building. And all of this was the work of Colonel Thomas Mould. And Thomas Mould was a colonel. By the time he retired, he was actually Major General Thomas Mould. He was a commander of Auckland's militia, he built the city's defences, and he built most of the roads and the bridges during the New Zealand Wars. Now, that building was demolished in 1885 when the ground underneath it was mined away for harbour developments, and temporarily St Paul's used a wooden church on Eden Crescent. And this was the design of Captain William Skinner, who is the same architect who designed and built our current church. And William Skinner was a rifleman. He served during the New Zealand Wars, and afterwards he received numerous sharpshooting awards nationally and internationally for that. And by the time he retired, he was major. The last one is all of the carving inside. If you have a look around you, you'll notice that all of the pillars have this beautiful carving around the top, the capitals. Every window is framed with little details at the top of the pillars and things around the kind of the squares at the top. There are various kind of bishops, kings, even a queen, and some other figures around. And all of this was actually a 2-year project carved by Captain William Felden. During the Great War, he was the commander of the German internment camp on Motuihi Island, and he was the brigade major of the Auckland Rifles. So, and also after the war, his whole career pretty much was making war memorials up and down the country. Locally, you may have seen his memorial at Helensville, and also the statue of George V at Matakana. That's all his work. The last architect involved in our church was this guy, a guy called Daniel Patterson. Now, he was not a military officer. He's the exception to the rule, and he built our chancel. So everything really from that large arch backwards was his work in 1936. But Daniel Patterson also built a war memorial tram shelter for St Paul's, something I'll talk about a bit later. So he too contributed to our military heritage. Again, this is the third building, but there are actually 3 stones which are that are original to the very first church. And they all have military links. And the first one is this. It's just to the right of those entrance doors as you're having a look, and it's a memorial stone to Captain William Hobson. Now, Hobson, of course, is famous for being the very first governor of New Zealand. But he was also a naval officer, and he's a really major name for Auckland. If you don't know, he actually bought the land, the Waitemata Harbour, that Auckland is built on for the purpose of building the city. He was among the very first settlers to come here and begin building things back in 1840, and he, within the first few months, commissioned the building of a church, St. Paul's Church. He laid the foundation stone in 1841, and he died during its construction. Hobson is buried in Simon Street Cemetery just up the road, but his memorial stone hangs here on our wall. The second stone is just like it. It's the mirroring one to the other side of the doors, and it's actually dedicated to Major General Dean Pitt. You may not have heard of this guy, but he was the commander in charge of all military forces in New Zealand around the time of Hobson. He was also a member of St Paul's Church. His 3 daughters were all married here by Bishop Selwyn, and 2 of them married on the same day. I don't know how they did that, but that's quite a crazy fun fact for you. The last stone, original to the first church, is, of course, our foundation stone, which, if you've not seen it, is close to the bell tower on the outside, somewhere just over there. And it was laid in 1841, surrounded by an honour guard of troops from the 80th Regiment by Captain Hobson. And then in 1895, it was reinstalled in our walls here, using the same silver trowel. St Paul's Church was actually the church of the garrison for more than 30 years. This map from 1851 kind of shows the huge extent of the military presence in Auckland around the time. And you can't see too much detail here, but if we zoom in, you can see St Paul's Church is kind of split very closely between Albert Barracks and Fort Britomart. And you'll notice on this picture, it's surrounded by troops at attention and Union flags and marching columns of soldiers, even a couple of cavalry. This map shows the position of Fort Britomart. We know Britomart today as being a low harbour kind of sea level area of land, but originally it was actually a high outcrop that overlooked the water. And when the British started building Auckland, they put a fortification up at Point Britomart. And you can see how close St Paul's Church was to that original base. Soldiers used to march from the barracks into St Paul's every week in full uniform, as this watercolour here beautifully depicts. Now, Britomart Point, as mentioned, was originally a high outcrop. It looked like this. And if you've got excellent eyesight, you may just spot at the top of the hill, you've got several cannons overlooking the water. The fort was not a particularly impressive structure. It was basically a defensive wall and then a ring of cannons that looked out. The rest was offices and barracks and things. But the church had such close ties with this garrison that when trouble started in 1845 up north and there were big concerns that the Maori might invade Auckland, St. Paul's was barricaded. Shutters were covering the windows with gun slots. The ground outside the church was leveled and flattened to provide no cover, and the church itself was set up to provide as the garrison hospital and the last place of refuge for the men and women of the city. Now, fortunately, nothing came of those fears. There was no invasion, but fears arose again in the 1860s with the onset of the land wars, and so St. Paul's was barricaded for a second time. In fact, there were such close connections that when the 58th Foot Regiment, which was the body of troops stationed at Britomart, left New Zealand permanently in 1858, they made 2 gifts to St. Paul's Church. The first was a set of brass candlesticks, and unfortunately, because I don't know which ones they are, I couldn't bring them out to show you. I didn't want to mislead you all. But one of the sets of candlesticks we use here is probably their original gift in 58. Secondly, and more significantly, they made the gift of the regimental colours. Now, that in itself is quite an impressive kind of gift to be bestowed. But the colours themselves are also significant. These were the very first military colours unfurled in New Zealand. So the colours bounced around between various temporary homes for about 40 years. And eventually, in 1901, Colonel John Mitchell raised the question again, what should we do with the flag? And it actually sparked an 8-year debate in the newspapers between the veterans, the existing regiment, the courts, and also the church. Canon Watson, who was the vicar of St. Paul's at the time, basically requested for the colours to be brought back into St. Paul's, now in this building. He said, first of all, St. Paul's was the church of the garrison for over 30 years. Secondly, the flag was given to us originally, and we should honour the hopes of the regiment. Now, his appeal was unsuccessful. The flag ended up going to the public library, and today you can see it displayed in the Auckland War Memorial Museum. So we don't have the colours, but we do have a number of plaques dedicated to the men that carried them. In the Requiem Chapel, which is the chapel there, to the right of the entrance as you come in, there's a whole number of plaques on the wall with the names of the officers and the soldiers who gave their life during the New Zealand Wars. In fact, those 2 windows on the left, the one of the king and the bishop, they were originally built as a memorial to those New Zealand troops. And the long brass plaque now in the chapel used to hang directly below those windows. But our most impressive, prominent memorial has been this tram shelter, mentioned previously by Daniel Patterson. It was built in 1919 as a monument to the Great War. And over the entranceway there was an arch, and it said, I want to get this just right, "Remembering these dead, let the living be humble." And below it were 2 trachyte stones. On the left was one listing the campaigns that ANZAC troops had been involved in, and on the right, this one here, was actually this stone. I like to have a bit of show and tell when I do these things. This stone was actually discovered face down in the basement a few weeks ago. It was underneath a wooden cabinet. And we brought it out and then carried it up the hill so you could all see it here this morning. Let's see if I can get this. Erected in honoured memory of the men and women connected with this church and parish who gave their lives for the empire during the Great War. Inside the shelter featured an Oamaru frieze, which is like a very pale stone, same as our pillars and columns, that listed 26 battles that our soldiers had been involved in. There were 4 stained glass windows that were unique because they mixed the heraldry of the diocese with the military patches and insignia of the Auckland units. There were 2 carvings in the middle of the shelter that bore the crests of the Auckland Mounted Rifles and the Auckland Infantry. And there was the list of 53 St. Paul's members and parishioners who died during the Great War. Now, after the Second World War, the shelter was updated, the new names were added, the windows were replaced with grills, and it was rededicated. But unfortunately, the shelter was quite often vandalized. The windows were replaced with grills because they had been smashed, and the trams no longer operated and buses stopped further up the street. So the decision was made in 1971 to demolish the shelter, and instead the names were transferred from those stones to this wooden roll of honour that we have today hanging in our Requiem Chapel. The last memorial that we're going to talk about today. Is everyone doing okay, by the way? Is this information overload, or is everyone... Okay, I'm getting some nods and some smiles. I'll keep going. The last one is this one. It's a plinth to Kenneth Preble, who was actually a vicar here at St. Paul's for 20 years, and a lot of pretty amazing things happened while he was the vicar here. That gets into a different kind of story of history, but hopefully you'll hear about that name again in the future. And it's just there on the wall outside the Lady Chapel. Now, Kenneth Preble, before he was the vicar here, was actually a military chaplain. He was assigned to 5th Dorset Regiment in the British Army, and he was their chaplain. And during the last phase of the war, Second World War now, his unit was part of Operation Jupiter. Now, if you kind of only know your history through movies, this is kind of the Saving Private Ryan moment. This is after D-Day, the Allies are marching towards Germany, they're kind of clearing out various stops in France, and the Nazis had fortified the French town of Caen, but they knew there was no way they would be able to hold their position if they lost the high ground to the southeast. So Hill 112 kind of became the pivotal point of being able to break the Nazis in Caen. So knowing its significance, they fortified the area with trenches and foxholes. They placed their top SS troops there and their panzer divisions, basically the best of what was left to hold it. Now, Operation Epsom had happened a few days before, so we're just going to rewind a little bit. Operation Epsom was the first operation to take Hill 112. And the British troops had advanced, they had managed to take the hill, but then German counterattacks had pushed them back and the ground had been lost. So Operation Jupiter, when Kenneth Preble comes in, was to retake the high ground. Now, the area around there was flat, full of cornfields. There are a few dotted farms, a few dotted copses of trees. But close-quarter fighting would be very common as people moved forward and then suddenly found themselves confronted with a concealed trench or outpost. So the fighting was pretty fierce, but by the end of the first day, the 5th Dorset had managed to take Hill 112. But overnight, German counterattacks pushed them back almost to the start line. They lost 240 men in 24 hours. And as the men fell among the corn, Father Preble would run over to them, comfort them, pray with them, and he would wave a makeshift flag that he kept with him in his pocket to draw the attention of the medical crews. And he would do this again and again, staying with each man until he was evacuated for the full operation. Once new defensive lines were drawn and the men had dug into little slit trenches, Kenneth Preble was walking around from one to the next, talking to the guys, encouraging them. And this was really dangerous work. By now, the advance had stopped, and so they were on the lookout for the defenders, and there were no communication trenches between these positions. So crawling would have at least been the smart thing to do, but according to his son John, Kenneth didn't expect to survive the war, and so he would walk between the posts. And as dusk fell on the 4th day, on the 13th of July in 1944, a German lookout saw Father Preble, called down mortar fire, and he was badly wounded and evacuated. So, as I come to close today's talk, I find myself full circle back at the window, Theodoric of Nyssa. And for the longest time, it actually really confused me. Why was Theodoric of Nyssa chosen to represent our military heritage as a church? Because basically, he's a historical unknown. And yet he stands here shoulder to shoulder with historical celebrities, King Oswald, Bishop Theodore, and Geoffrey Chaucer. You may not know who they are, but there are books written about them, and there's a lot known about them, and they all did really cool things. But there's basically nothing on Theodoric. So why him? Well, I think I've unraveled the mystery. First of all, the window was bequeathed to Travers MacLean, who was involved in the St. John's ambulance. Secondly, St. Paul's, as a very early settler church, or the first Auckland settler church and an Anglican church, has very strong ties with England. We're even named after St. Paul's Cathedral in London. Thirdly, this window was going to reflect our military heritage to be in line with the 4 key themes. And so you've got the ambulance of St. John, England, and the military. So the choice of the Grand Prior of the English headquarters of the Knights of St. John's Hospital seems like the perfect choice. But even so, that just gives you a list of 32 possible Grand Priors of Clerkenwell House in the UK. So why him? Because many of the others accomplished amazing military things. We know lots about them, or they became key influential people nationally. There is one major entry. There are actually 2 entries that we have historically that refer to what Theodoric, who he was or what he did. The first is an entry, and the main one, is in Matthew Paris's Historia Anglorium, written in 1253. And he writes this: "The Hospitallers sent their prior, Theodoric, a German by birth and a most clever knight, with a body of other knights and stipendiary attendants and a large sum of money to the assistance of the Holy Land. They, having made all arrangements, set out from their house in Clerkenwell and proceeded in good order with about 30 shields uncovered, spears raised and preceded by their banner, through the midst of the city towards the bridge, that they might obtain the blessing of the spectators, and bowing their heads with their cowls lowered, commended themselves to the prayers of all. There is one other note that exists, and it's next to his name on a list of priors, and it says, "He gave to the sisters of Buckland and their successors £38, 12 shillings and 8 to be paid at 2 different periods of the year on condition that prayers should be offered up for the repose of the said Theodoric and his successors." So, Theodoric was no military giant. Okay, the only thing we know about him for sure is that he went on a campaign to respond to a crusader defeat, and he never returned. He's not known for any kind of great military exploits. And I kind of realized that's the point. Theodoric was a man of prayer and holy devotion. Yes, he was a military general, but he was also a monk and the head of the English Hospitallers. The only records we have of him show him displaying public humility and appeals for prayer, not only for himself, but always for those with him. Because St. Paul's has a rich military heritage, not because our forebears have conquered, but because they've thrown themselves on lit grenades, built churches to God's glory, provided shelter and medicine in times of war. They've refused awards and honors that might offend, built memorials to recognize sacrifice, and wave flags over fallen brothers. So, this ANZAC Sunday, let's not just remember our troops as some kind of external military entity, but let's be grateful for 175 years when the life and blood of St. Paul's congregants and parishioners has been laid on the line and sometimes lost. History shows we remember these guys really well here. So let's keep these stories alive. Thanks.